Watch this, no water. Never melt snow without having some water in your pot. Probably one of the most common comments I get on my channel for anything winter camping. Experts like to make definitive statements, and that's true everywhere. The more authoritative you want to be, the more you make black and white statements. One thing's right, one thing's wrong, what you always have to do or what you should never do. And that's a perfect example to me, because what happens when you're outside and you have no water to kind of prime your snow when you're melting it? I have two other examples that are completely different but tell a kind of similar tale. When it comes to melting snow to get my water, I'd say 50% of the time I don't have some water to prime. The reason why you're always told not to melt snow directly to water is because you can burn your pot. What happens if you pack a bunch of loose, dry snow into your cook pot, turn the fire on, that snow kind of sublimates and melts and gets sucked up into the snow higher up in the pot, and you end up with a layer or a kind of a gap, an air gap, and you can really scald your pot and bend it and warp it, potentially ruining your cook pot and also getting kind of this scorched flavor in your water. But there's a simple workaround, which is to just put in a little bit of snow at a time, keep your pot off the burner, kind of twirl it around a bit, and as it melts, you just push it down. And before you know it, you'll have 100, 200 ml of water, and then you can really start adding snow, and you're pretty much off to the races, no problem. It's like you saved water to prime the process. Now, why don't I always keep water for that? Well, sometimes I get thirsty. You know, you're on the trail and you've got another hour to go to camp and you're feeling parched, and maybe you have 200 ml or half a liter of water, and I'm just gonna drink it because I think it's more important to stay on top of that than to try and keep it for later. The other thing is that depending where you keep your water in, it can freeze. When it gets really cold out, the less water you have, the more likely it's gonna freeze. Now, I know some people who keep a little sort of soft flask in their jacket, that works. It's just not something that I'm super interested in doing. I find it more of a hassle for myself than just getting to camp and starting to melt snow. So if I have water, I'll use it and I'll prime. It makes the process a lot quicker and easier, but realistically, it's no big deal. The second example that I have is what to wear in your sleeping bag at night. Do you change? Do you keep your damp clothes on? You know, all kinds of things. And people get pretty enthusiastic about what they think is right and wrong. Again, the reality is that it's always different. Every condition is different. Depends what the temperature is outside. Depends if your clothing got really wet. Depends what your sleeping bag's rated as. Everything, you know, you can just sort of add up all the variables and then say, is there one rule for this? No, there's not. Sometimes I'll go to bed with wet clothes on. Sometimes if I have some spare clothes, I'll change out. It's actually pretty rare that I do that because I've got my system down packed pretty well, especially in the winter. It's rare that I'll have absolutely soaked clothing, and my clothing manages moisture really well. The time where you've got, when it's more challenging is sometimes in the fall, like yesterday, when it was cold and wet. Still managed to manage everything pretty well, but I had some thermal leggings that were dry in my pack, and the bottom of my soft shell pants were pretty damp when I got into camp. So to go to bed, I just switched into those thermal leggings, a grid fleece, and was super warm all night. And then the other part of that story is, do you add layers to stay warmer at night in your sleeping bag. There's an old wives' tale, I think, that if you go to bed naked, you'll be warmer. But let me tell you, I've tried that years ago when I was about 11 or 12. I'd heard that kind of myth and did it, and I froze. And I've known better ever since. And everyone knows it. When you're at home, if you go to bed and you're wearing too much clothes and you're hot, what do? You take off some clothes. If you're too cold, you put on some clothes and you put on a thicker comforter, and you'll be warmer. It's the same thing out here. The thing is that you only have one sleeping bag. You make your best guess as to what temperature rating you want it, but it's got kind of a set point where it works well. And then how do you adjust your comfort from there? Well, if you're too hot, take off layers, unzip the sleeping bag and vent. And if you're cold, you close it down tight. And if you're still cold, you put on some more layers. So it's just what works in practice. I've done it too many times. I've spent too much time outside in cold weather to know that going to bed with less on makes you colder. You want whatever you're wearing in your sleeping bag to be an even layer. Just think about it this way. If you went to bed in a mountaineering down, one-piece suit that was rated for, minus 30 inside of your sleeping bag, and you didn't put anything on your feet were bare, your feet would get cold. And I know that's true because often our hands get cold in our sleeping bag. Something that people forget is to put on gloves or an even layer of insulation to match what they're wearing. So if you're in bed wearing kind of thermal top and bottoms, socks, well, you want to have some kind of thin glove on that matches that thickness, because if you don't, your hands are going to get cold. You're just going to feel the coolness of the sleeping bag. If you do choose to put on more layers to be even warmer, I still try and match them. One of the times that I was out in the winter where it was the coldest weather I've ever experienced in my recollection was a trip with Justin, and it dropped to minus 35 or minus 40. We were in a kind of a low point, so all the cool air collected, which I'm going to get into for topic number 3. But I just had my negative 20 sleeping bag, which was way undergunned for those conditions. So what do? Well, I put on all my insulation on my legs, every layer I had. I had Apex insulated pants, my big negative 30 down jacket, as my down booties, everything, and my warmest mittens. And I wore all of that in my sleeping bag. It went down, like I said, minus 35, maybe minus 40. It was brutally cold. And obviously, once you go to bed, you're cool. But I woke up, 2, 3 in the morning and was nice and warm. It would not have worked out that way if I had just gone to bed in my long johns and fleece top. There's just no way. And I've done that over and over and over again. I just know how it works. Now, you can also make the argument that you'd be better off just having the sleeping bag that's rated to that temperature. But you don't always know. Not everyone has the budget for something like a Polar Ranger, which I think is the best winter sleeping bag out there for extreme conditions. But I'd say that for most people, a negative 20 degree sleeping bag is more than enough. A good one. I used to have one from Marmot. I have the one that I use now from Thermarest. They get you into some pretty good winter conditions. And generally speaking, if the forecast is for below negative 20, I avoid those trips. They start to get dangerous and they start to get not all that fun. If it's something that, conditions change and it dips, I need to know how to be prepared for that, even if the forecast was for lows of -15, closing in on -20, things can change, temperatures can drop. So I like to know how to be ready for those conditions. If you're out and you're cold, what are you gonna do? You're gonna put on more clothes. If you haven't experienced that, then I just don't know if it's fair to comment on it. Example number 3 is picking a campsite. And there's a lot of recommendations out there on this, how to pick the best campsite. But the reality is, it's pretty rare that you really get to pick your campsite. Obviously, you do within a certain range of parameters, but often you have to camp where there's a designated campsite, and there you have no choice. The other situation is you don't have designated campsites, but you're traveling from A to B, it's getting dark, and then at some point you just have to pick what's good enough. And then it becomes a balance of what's important to you. People often talk about not camping in temperature sinks. So low areas and valleys where cold air pools, because it's gonna be several degrees colder than another place just a little bit higher. Now, is that true? Yeah. But if you're in an area like right here, and for whatever reason, it was getting to be close to time to camp, well, there's a nice flat spot right there, and looks like a pretty good spot to camp. Are we in a low area here? Would it get a little bit colder than elsewhere? Maybe. But at some point, what are you gonna do about it? Are you gonna start climbing up the side of a hill to go find somewhere that's slightly warmer, and then maybe never even find a good spot to camp? When it's getting dark and you find a spot that is nice and flat and kind of meets all of your other needs, let me tell you, I'm picking the low spot that might be a little bit colder. I can handle slightly colder temperatures. Things that are really hard to deal with are high winds. And high winds make for a miserable night. They're also dangerous. So that's one of the things that I will avoid as much as I can, is being somewhere where it's really exposed to high winds. A few degrees colder, but calm, that's not a problem in my mind. Obviously, you don't want to camp in a bog where you're gonna get soaked and your tent's gonna flood at night. So, it's a balance, like anything else. It's really hard to have this one set of rules and try and stick to it all the time, because you're gonna get frustrated. It definitely makes people sound more authoritative. It makes them sound like they know what they're talking about. But I'd like to find an example of all these people showing where they've picked one campsite over another, specifically in an area because it was higher or lower. The reality is that you're going for kind of aesthetics. What is a place that makes you feel comfortable, that is a place that you like. I personally prefer more open campsites. I like to have the light of an open campsite, and I find it less risky when it comes to trees and things that might fall. Sometimes some trees can offer a little bit of protection from wind, but I definitely wouldn't want to be next to giant trees like this in a big windstorm. I'll pick a little roll in the ground, a little kind of hump or something like that, some low bushes to protect me from the wind, because in a forest like this, if the wind really picks up, it can be pretty scary when those trees start to bend and snap. So that's all I got for today. Remember, it's rare that there's a definitive answer on how to do things when you're outside in places like this. It's always about a balance and finding what works for you.